Welcome to the Did Nothing Wrong podcast, where we cut through the noise and help you make sense of the chaotic information space around us. I'm Griff Somke. Scott Santens has been a tireless advocate for the concept of UBI, or Universal Basic Income, which would guarantee everyone in society an income floor. With the dawn of the AI era upon us, as well as the changes that we have seen already in the last several years, this is definitely an idea that's time has come. I'm excited to be able to discuss it with him today. Stick around.
This is a crusade. This is a holy war against the deep state.
Where are the dictators? Where are the strong men?
Donald Trump is our instrument for retribution.
I'm going to fight for Christians. I'm going to fight for white people.
They have the Great Reset. We have the Great Awakening.
And why shouldn't I root for Russia? Because I am.
I want to see these people go through misery because of their grooming against our children.
After the assailant entered the home asking, "Where's Nancy? Where's Nancy?" Those are the very same words used by the mob when they stormed the United States Capitol.
I did nothing wrong.
Scott, welcome to Did Nothing Wrong. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Griff. Happy to be here.
So part of the reason I wanted to have you on the podcast is because you've been advocating for years for something called Universal Basic Income, which in the broad strokes is a monthly income floor with no means testing or strings attached. How did you get started on this project? What was your kind of intro to this concept and making this a focus of what you put your time into?
Yeah, I got into this back in 2013, and it was actually through Reddit. There was like a discussion thread that hit the front page that was about like how quickly technology was advancing and how no one was really talking about it or ready for it. And so back in 2013, there was like no discussion of the impacts of automation and stuff. No one was really talking about robots and AI and whatnot. So it was a forward-thinking kind of thread. And later that year, like the first of the major studies came out that actually really brought that to public consciousness, which was the Oxford study talking about how 47% of jobs could be automated within the next 20 years. And, that was a lot of the stuff in that thread really kind of opened my eyes to, thinking about, oh, wow, like here I thought I was following technology pretty closely. And, as someone who really enjoys technology and knowing about this stuff. And I was just surprised by a lot of different things, how quickly things had come along. And in that thread, people were talking about this, it's like a highly recommended book called Manna by Marshall Brain.
Okay.
And in this book was kind of a dystopian, utopian approach to this, like, what if a lot of stuff gets automated? And so like you can go one route and everything kind of just goes to shit. A lot of people are worse off in all kinds of ways. And then the other way is actually making technology work for everybody, and how like that can be like kind of a Star Trek kind of pathway.
Right.
And the author supported universal basic income as like this way of like going from one to the other. And so I started to look into it. And once I started looking into it, like looking into the history of it, the evidence behind it, the various experiments, I just came to realize that this was not only like something that was the way of like getting to this better path, but like, even without robots and automation, it should be something we should have already done because it just simply works better. It's just a better approach. And I just decided that, it was something that was so important to make happen that I just decided to start like devoting all my time to it.
Okay. That's very cool that you saw something like that and just picked up on it. It's interesting that you bring up automation because when I was prepping for this episode, I started reading some of the stories, including one from UNC, North Carolina, and they were talking about the idea of automation as something that could be a driver towards this. And I found myself kind of disagreeing with the professor who wrote this because the idea that machines would replace jobs, but usually new types of jobs were always created elsewhere. And while that is true, those jobs more and more frequently aren't really equivalent to the jobs that they're replacing.
Right.
So we're replacing, in a lot of cases, a union job with good benefits that's capable of providing for a family unit with something that pays a whole lot less and has very little security. And the idea that we're going to have to supplement that somehow if we don't want to end up in, as you put it, kind of a dystopia, almost a Mad Max type of environment at some point, is very prevalent, especially right now. In 2020, I think a lot of people in this country got exposed to this concept that hadn't necessarily heard of it before through the presidential candidacy of Andrew Yang.
Mm-hmm.
He was running on what he called at the time the freedom dividend, which was the idea of giving everybody in the country $1,000 a month. You were a consultant for that campaign, correct?
Yeah.
How did you end up connecting with him?
So I had met him before he even started running, and it was we were both connected to the Economic Security Project even before like that actually launched. So we had, a shared group of friends and acquaintances through that. So we met like early on at one of like the first like smaller conferences, kind of more like a meetings than a conference, and just got along really well from the very beginning. And he, not too long after we first met, I would say like within the next year from that, he told me he was going to start running for president, and asked me what I thought about it. And I just remember, we were both sitting at a place in New Orleans that was like one of my favorite lunch places, and we're just sitting there. And I just remember just being very excited that he was going to do that, and just thinking. And I told him that if he just made it to like one debate, just to a televised national debate, that alone would be like a massive victory to be able to like bring this discussion to just, an audience of many millions of people. So, it just far surpassed my hopes and expectations for him to bring that to the front of the national discussion.
Yeah, it's definitely, I think, what put this concept back on the radar for a lot of people, because it's not a new concept. This is something that has been kicked around in one form and another for, hundreds of years, if nothing else. The time in my research, I found that it seems like we got closest to this would have been in, I think it was 1969, when President Richard Nixon actually proposed this as part of his budget that year. And that's probably going to shock a few people listening, that such a seemingly progressive idea came out of such a conservative time. Can you talk a little bit about the thought process behind what Nixon and his administration were thinking putting this together?
Yeah, that was like learning about that was one of the things that was new to me when I first got into basic income too. Thinking, oh my gosh, like this is something with a rich history. I didn't realize that we'd even done pilots around the country back in the 70s. And yeah, you're correct that Nixon proposed what he called was the Family Assistance Plan back in 1969, and it passed the House twice in 70 and 71. And both times it was didn't make it through the Senate Finance Committee to the Senate, never made it to a vote to get through there. But if it would have, then it would have been signed into law by Nixon. And yeah, that whole history is just fascinating. People should know too that I would call it was a guaranteed income plan. I wouldn't call it universal basic income because it didn't go to everybody. It would have gone to only families with kids. And so it was more like the child tax credit, the monthly child tax credit that we did in 2021, but also slightly different because it did go to everyone in the family. So let's say you've got a household of 4, and let's say a mom and dad and 2 kids, then it would have gone to the mom and the dad, and there would have been a component for each kid. And then there was a work requirement attached. But kind of. And so there was no work requirement for the kids components. So that would have gone to the kids and, through the parents, regardless of employment status. And there was a hard work requirement for the dad. So if the dad wasn't working, then he wouldn't have gotten his component. And then if the mom wasn't working, she would have gotten it if the kids were under age 6, and then she wouldn't have gotten it if the kids were over age 6. So it was like this kind of semi-work requirement that varied according to, whoever it was for in the household. And of course, it wouldn't have gone to any single adults in the country. You needed to have kids. But it would have dramatically reduced poverty in a major way, and would have set a real precedent. And I think that if we had done it back then and it would have passed the Senate and been signed into law, then I think we'd be in a different place now.
Right, right. And one of the other things that seems like it would have made it a little easier to pay for such a thing is that the top marginal tax rate in Nixon's era was somewhere around 70%. And it's significantly less than that now. Is this eventually how this thing gets successfully implemented in terms of paying for it? Do they just have to decide that we're not going to be able to go with 30% marginal tax rates at the top end and somehow raise that? The funding proposals, I guess, I'm curious, how does this get paid for in theory?
Yeah, if we're going to get into like paying for it and cost and stuff, which is definitely one of the top three concerns about a UBI, I think, first of all, I just want everyone to know that a basic income doesn't mean that we're like expanding the money supply by like $3 trillion a year, just because it's not as simple as saying, all right, what is the amount of the money multiplied by the number of people? It does matter about like what taxes are paired with it, because if you are pairing it with some kind of income tax, then, if you're receiving $12,000 and paying a higher amount of tax of $12,000, then there's a zero net transfer there.
Right.
So that person could be seen as like paying for their own, and there's no cost to the government, to the taxpayer, anything like that. So you really have to determine like the net transfer from those who are net payers to those who are net recipients. And that is the actual cost of the program, which is actually much smaller than the gross cost. Again, depending on details, you're looking at maybe a third of the gross cost. So you're looking at more like somewhere around $1 trillion, somewhere north or south of that, depending on the details. But then when it comes to actually how we could go about introducing that in, say, a more affordable, kind of way, then there's programs that we could reform or eliminate. And that's not only like welfare programs, like is traditionally considered, but also tax expenditures.
Right.
So, like everyone is already receiving the standard deduction, and no one like thinks of it as being some kind of like amount of money provided to them by the government.
No, it's just a form you fill out on your taxes.
Right. And and that's one of the problems, I think, is that so many people think that only like those people get help and not me. And that's one of the problems, I think, like one of the political issues is that if you feel that you're being ignored and like your tax monies are going to other people and you're not getting any benefit, then there's going to be political repercussions to that. So I think even part of the importance besides like helping, finance a basic income with these tax expenditures is actually just making sure that people realize that they're getting something, that something's tangible that they're receiving. So when you're replacing stuff like TANF and SNAP, I don't want to replace everything. I think disability should be additional to a basic income since, their cost of living is higher.
Right.
But you can do stuff like the standard deduction, replace that. You can do stuff like, the home mortgage interest deduction. There's various tax expenditures they can replace as well. We're actually spending over $1.5 trillion a year on tax expenditures. So there's a lot there. Again, not like everything, but there's certain things that we can reform. And then, of course, the amount of basic income, we can start pretty low. And I'm perfectly fine with that. Like I totally supported $1,000 per month from Andrew Yang. That was essentially the poverty level then when he was running. But we don't have to start at the poverty level either. Like if we even did it, eliminating severe poverty, which is like around $500 per month, that's a big deal. We know that the child tax credit that was averaging about $430 per month per household in 2021, which reduced child poverty by 40%, was a big deal. So, even if it was like $400 per month for everybody, that would be a big deal. And one of the proposals that looked at kind of like the affordable, kind of way of doing this, you could do a $500 per month basic income for all adults and kids, and that would only require a 7% additional flat income surtax. So like boost everybody's income taxes by 7%, and everyone would receive this amount of money, which would nullify, a bunch of that increase for most of the population, leaving like, about the top 10%, 20% as net payers, and the rest of everybody else with essentially, a increased disposable income through a decrease in taxes.
Right, right. And as you said, there are certain programs that can then get eliminated as a result of this.
Right.
And I think that an interesting observation that you have having that conversation is most people don't actually realize the amount of tax breaks and cash that they're already kind of getting over the course of the year
Right.
because everything is so just automated to some extent. Like I said, the standard deduction is just a box you check on your taxes every year. You don't really think too much about what that actually means. Do you see a significant amount of pushback from people who have backgrounds in the social services? Because one of the things I noticed is that, and this is kind of sticky here, but when some of the people that have participated in some of the trials that you mentioned earlier have gotten onto a program like this, they've been able to take real significant steps out of bad economic situations, almost in some cases more so than the current bureaucracy has allowed them to do.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you see a lot of pushback from people involved with the current bureaucracy on this, because there's a lot of people in this country that are in that industry to some big extent. And I'm trying not to sound like Chris Rufo here.
Yeah, no, any time that we suggest replacing any kind of existing program, there's going to be pushback from the left. You know, a lot of that is just out of a constant like fight to maintain these programs from erosion.
Right.
And I think that part of that problem is there's a saying called programs for the poor programs, where, you know, if you're targeting those in poverty and everyone else feels that they're paying only for those people in poverty, then, you know, they're looking at, oh, they're lazy people and I don't like that program. Let's let's reduce it. Let's add work requirements so that we can kick more people off the program.
Right.
Let's add more restrictions and make it harder. Let's have 100 pages of paperwork or something to apply for something and set up all these hoops to hurt this. So from that perspective, those on the left are like, I'm not going to give anything on this. We have to protect these programs. But I think it's important to replace some of these programs, because some of these programs have these they're highly conditional and they're highly means tested. And that's the problem with them, not only from a political perspective, but from an economic perspective of higher marginal tax rates. You know, these programs stack. So if you get a program with a 50% phase out, and then you have another program with a 10% phase out and another program with another 10% phase out, then you're looking at like 70% marginal tax rate between those, in which case they're essentially losing 70 cents of every dollar that they earn. And, you know, it just makes sense to not pursue employment or higher incomes, higher wages, if you're actually ending up better off or barely better off thanks to the loss of these programs. So the beauty of universal basic income is that this never goes away. The only marginal tax rate that hits you is the actual tax rate, because that's the only tax.
Right.
When it comes to a phase out, that is like a hidden tax that people don't think of as a tax. And we're like, for some reason, like the lefties, even both sides of are seemingly happy, or at least nonchalant or not caring about taxing those who are under the poverty line with like 70% tax rates and beyond, even exceeding 100%.
Right.
And not even thinking about it. And they're just saying like, you know, tax the rich. You know, the rich aren't paying enough taxes. But it's like, you know, you'll have someone in conservative saying, we can't tax the rich more. If you raise it to 45% or something, they'll stop working. And that same person is looking at a poor person facing an 80% tax rate, saying they're so lazy for not working. You know,
right.
That's part of the problem.
And at some point, you kind of have to get consistent on that. So I have a couple of objections that people have brought up. I told a couple people I was going to be talking to you and talking about this, and the response in a couple cases was kind of just questions about it. And I kind of know the answers to some of this stuff because I've been reading the material on it for a few days now and getting the idea, but I'm going to kind of play a little devil's advocate, if that's all right with you, on some of this.
Sure.
So the number one thing that I think that people tend to bring up is, won't people won't this just turn into people doing drugs with it, or people drinking with it, or people spending it in some sort of completely frivolous way and it not really making anyone's life better. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, we actually have a lot of evidence for that one. There's just study after study after study around the world of cash transfer programs in general. Of course, all of these are concerns about when people just use it on drugs and alcohol and stuff. You can look at a meta-analysis of all these giant pile of studies, and the result is that in general, there's a slight decrease in what's called temptation goods. So yeah, drugs, alcohol, tobacco, and these things. Part of the reason for that is that to a large degree, people tend to abuse drugs and alcohol as a form of self-medication,
right?
Largely for the stress of, a life that they're unhappy with,
Sure.
If you're stressed out all the time, if you're unhappy, you got to tune it out. And that's a great way to check out when you're using that various drugs and stuff. So if you make sure that people actually have some economic security, that they have a way of seeing a light at the end of the tunnel, that there's not just darkness all around them, that there's a way to spend time with other people and engage with their friends and family and communities, then you just see this reduction in this kind of behavior. And yeah, you just see it over and over again.
Yes. I mean, we've never really been especially great at accounting for the cost and stress that not having money in a society that's so reliant on the idea of being able to financially solve most problems creates. And I think there's a lot of that in there, people self-medicating to try and deal with the not being able to barely get by in modern society to some extent.
Yeah. I mean, one of the biggest problems that we're facing in America are the deaths of despair.
Right.
The deaths of despair are mostly entirely just impacting those without college educations. And, if you look at that, and within that, it's mostly men. And it's a serious problem that we're facing. And the idea that, if we were to provide a basic income to everyone, and that would somehow leave these non-college educated men worse off, no, of course not.
Right.
The reason why these are economic deaths of despair from the result of just feeling, what are they going to do? And that's another concern that people have too, is that, if you give people money, then they'll hurt their sense of purpose.
Right.
They'll just they won't work, they won't do anything. And again, we just don't see that. We see that having a basic income actually is enabling. It's it takes money to make money. We're told to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, but how do you do that if you don't have any boots?
Exactly.
So basic income is money for boots, and that's how people use them.
Ate those last week. Sorry. But yeah, there's definitely that perception that, if you work hard enough, you can absolutely get ahead regardless of any of the obstacles that might be in your way. And you bring up the deaths of despair. That's a great point, because in a lot of cases, that's just simply not true anymore. And I think we're really starting to see that sort of wave build of people who are insanely frustrated with their circumstances, and they don't see a way it gets better from here.
Yeah, I mean, that's my takeaway from what we just saw in this election. People can look at this as some kind of strategy failure or something by Harris and her campaign or whatever. And I think it's much deeper than that. This was something that has been impacting people not only for, this past 4 years under this administration, but prior to that. And this is something that's been impacting America for decades now to an increasing degree.
Right.
And, if we're going to fix that, then we've got to think about really actually lifting people out of these circumstances where they're being left behind by this changing economy that's been, coring out manufacturing area, creating the Rust Belt, shipping jobs overseas, and automating people out of jobs,
right,
and pushing down on wages. All of these things are systemic outcomes.
This is all stuff that has been almost predicted in the idea that people have gone into certain industries saying we're going to disrupt this industry. But one of the things that gets disrupted is people and wages. And we had a kind of frightening, somewhat related incident where a CEO of United Healthcare was shot to death.
Mm-hmm.
in New York in broad day, or right before broad daylight, on the street by somebody who was incredibly intentional about it. And the response that I saw out of almost everybody was very telling in terms of where people's heads are at right now.
Oh, yeah.
In terms of the despair, it's like nobody seemed to be sympathetic in the slightest to this. And I think that's actually really frightening. The idea that we're at a place right now as a society that people see something like that, which is obviously wrong. No one should murder anybody on the sidewalk, and say, well, kind of saw why, kind of understand it. And it seems like we can keep going down that road, which seems to be the choice that we've made. Or we can stop and say, hey, wait a minute. We need to understand that we have, hundreds of millions of people here that are going to end up being left behind if it keeps going in this direction.
Yeah. What was it? The 3 bullet casings had the, was it deny and...
Deny, depose, and defend.
Right. Deny, depose, defend, which is, I guess, it's an insurance approach. So like clearly this was either someone who lost a family member or was experiencing this, strategy by the health insurance company. And it's hard to say if we're going to start seeing more of this and if it's like extends beyond, so there's certainly, as you said, there's so many people that just fully like empathize with this and even agree with it as being like a totally fine thing to do. They're looking at this as, oh, well, this person is personally responsible for millions of people suffering and even, how many countless people dying as a result of his decisions. So therefore it's okay. Like that's the kind of logic there. Will that extend to other businesses? Is it something where, like an oil executive could be in danger? Could it be just like an AI, like a tech executive?
Yeah.
If you're like actually automating jobs away, then is this actually something that we're going to see more of? Like Nick Hanauer, a decade ago was talking about the pitchforks are coming for billionaires.
Right.
Maybe we're there. Maybe we've arrived at that moment where inequality has gotten so severe. We saw even the big spike post-pandemic where it's just too much. And inequality is just heavily corrosive to societies, which is, again, another reason why I think universal basic income is so important, because it does reduce inequality aside from reducing, insecurity and poverty. These are like the 3 things that I think are so important to alleviate. It's far beyond just a poverty-related program. It is about chronic insecurity, creating stability for people. And it's about this just incredibly destructive impacts of extreme inequality that we've just got to get a handle on. But yeah, I was shocked too, as far as just seeing the general like consensus of the results of this news. Like it was not people going, oh my gosh, that's terrible. It was just going like, either I entirely agree with this or it's not the right thing to do, but I totally get it.
Yeah.
And then even for those who were saying, I disagree with it, like a lot of people are just saying it because like you don't want to say that it's the right thing to do. It's not like someone is like, oh, that's a horrible, horrible thing that you did. It's just like, it's performative, I feel, a lot of it. Like,
right.
Which is just crazy.
Nobody wants to be on the record advocating for murder.
Right.
Again, it was really just terrifying. The idea that whoever did this, you can tell from the footage that got released, was a professional. This is somebody who's probably done this before. Like some hitman who apparently got his claims denied or something was one of the lines I saw. Didn't know they had that kind of insurance in that line of work, but who knows? But I worry a lot that we're going to see more of this. One of the references that people have been making is to a period of political violence in Italy from the late 60s to the early 80s that people refer to as the years of lead, where there were a lot of both left and right political assassinations in those years. And I find myself being absolutely terrified of the idea that we're cruising into an American version of that, when in Italy, maybe 12% of the people have guns.
Right.
And we have a gun and a half for every person in this country right now. So the idea that people are upset and frustrated and have no better way to express that, and there are just the sheer amount of guns out there in the population that there are, means this could end up getting incredibly bad.
Yeah, we're in a tinderbox and we're only going to see more and more economic unemployment from AI. People are going to lose their jobs, going to find it hard to get another job. Incomes are going to be stagnant, again, because of the impacts of AI, which are mostly about depressing wages and not necessarily about total loss of jobs, because as you said earlier, you do end up finding another job, but does it pay more? Probably not. Sometimes it can if you're able to reskill or get lucky or find something. Besides that, cost of living, I expect to go up in the next administration, especially if he does all the tariffs that he wants to do.
Mm-hmm.
It'll just be even harder with higher prices and lower wages, and that combined with the existing danger of high inequality, seeing any more high inequality because of this, it's not looking good.
Right. And that's why I think that if somebody wants to run on this in 2 years or in 4 years and kind of just make their campaign 2 basic points, it's like, we're going to do universal basic income of some sort, and we're going to do something along the lines of universal health care.
Yeah.
Because we're at a point now where both of these things, either we roll them out soon or it might end up being too late. And if they're serious about causing the amount of economic pain that Trump and Musk and everybody responsible for the incoming administration says they're going to cause as a result of the choices they're about to make, I think that people might really be ready to hear this in a few years.
Yeah, I think so too. I think that the proper takeaway, again, from what we just saw, is this, I would say kind of like the Bernie was right critique, saying that this is about like economic populism. And each time, like Trump won when it was populist versus institutionalist. And again, Trump was faced with another institutionalist. And the thinking was that, well, we're talking about a self-coup attempt on January 6th. And, this is like not only like institutionalist as far as like, let's keep the status quo going, but like this was institutionalist as far as like, we got to support democracy instead of, potential like authoritarian dictatorship kind of thing. But people were still completely willing to go, well, I'm tired of the status quo and I'm willing to roll the dice. And we've never had that choice of which kind of anti-institutionalist, anti-status quo kind of direction should we go. And I think if America was faced with that, saying, do you want to go in this direction, this is different, or do you want to go in this direction that's different? I think they're going to go like the Bernie Sanders kind of direction of, let's actually focus on the economics and focus on health. Let's do universal health care and let's do universal basic income. And I think that universalism is like key. You have to make sure that everyone sees themselves benefiting from it.
Right.
The Democrat insistence on means testing, on targeting, I think is not the way to go and is dangerous. There's a study that I think sheds a lot of light on this kind of choice between universal policies and means tested policies. And this looked at this cash policy that impacted people, and then they looked at either side of the qualifying point. So, imagine, let's say we decide to set the line at 200% of the poverty line.
Right.
And that's the only people who benefit from some cash program. Well, if you're right below that line and you get it, then your support and trust in government increases by about 1 percentage point. And if you're on the other side of that line, then your trust in government falls by 10 percentage points.
Right.
So it's actually highly damaging to social cohesion to be, means tested out of something. If you feel that you are in need of help and the government says, no, you're earning too much money, like solve your own problems.
Right.
Then that's really damaging to the entire democracy.
Yeah, no, we see that with taxes now. We see that when you're really close to one tax bracket, you're just a couple deductions away from paying a much lower rate. As a result of your income, you made just enough money to end up in a higher bracket. I wonder how many of those people have lost more than 10% of their trust in the way the whole system works as a result. So it makes perfect sense that this would be the same thing.
Yeah.
And I think that that's absolutely correct, that this has to be a non-means tested thing. I think one of the ways I would personally try to sell it is say, look, Elon Musk gets the same check I do every month. Does he need it? No, absolutely he does not.
Yeah, and he's going to pay more in taxes than he gets. So that's the key element too, is that you got to make sure everyone's included, but also yes, taxes will go up. Elon Musk is going to pay far more than he gets in a basic income. So why does it matter? He already gets these, a massive amount of tax expenditures in the form of, itemizing his deductions. And like, are we complaining about that? Do we say it's wrong for Elon Musk to be able to itemize his deductions? Like, again, no, it's invisible and no one talks about it, but it is a large subsidy from the state that he's already getting.
Right. And this is something that under, a sane tax policy combined with a universal basic income is something we could probably change to a point where it would be a massive net benefit for, people going forwards on this. I really think that this is an idea whose time may have just come. And that's why I'm going to probably spend a lot of the next couple of years talking about this. Because the other thing about this is if you do it right, it doesn't alienate anyone.
Right.
This is not something that has to be turned into an us versus them type of situation. This is actual positive change for people who find themselves, not just here, but you see it all over the world, getting essentially left behind in the progress of society. And people are starting to get very, very angry about that.
Yeah.
The French government just fell as well. And we're seeing this all over the world. The incumbent wave that took out Harris took out incumbents everywhere.
Yeah.
And I don't see that abating anytime soon. If for whatever reason things are still up really bad under, 4 years of Trump and we're still having elections, then whoever takes over from him is probably not going to do particularly well.
Yeah, some country is going to be the first to do this because this is a global phenomenon. Just rising inequality, technology is everywhere. The impacts of it are everywhere. Like, I think that in order for it to work or to be passed in the US especially, I think people need to see it as like an earned dividend,
right,
as a result of AI. The Alaska dividend has existed since 1982. That's a 40-year plus UBI of about $1,500 per year on average to every adult and child in Alaska. Highly successful. People do not think of it as any kind of welfare program because it's considered like a right, as being like a resource right. It's saying, who does the oil belong to? Well, it belongs to all of us. Well, who does AI belong to? Who does just all technology belong to? When it comes to AI, who trained it? Like we did. Like our data is what it made it all possible.
All those CAPTCHAs you filled out with the stop signs and the bikes and everything else. Yeah, you trained it.
Everything we've written, everything, like this is for centuries of writing has gone into this. So it's not only like present day, but this is like an inheritance, it should be seen.
Yeah.
Who should benefit from like someone's writing from 200 years ago? Should like only 1% of the country benefit from that writing from this person who died 200 years ago?
No.
Like clearly we all should benefit from that. So I think a key point will be marketing UBI as being this AI dividend and like this kind of technological inheritance. I think that's a way of getting around like left versus right politics and getting around this kind of like thinking of it as being like a welfare, anti-poverty kind of program.
Right. Definitely.
Everyone should benefit from it.
Because we are looking at a future now where we have fewer and fewer good choices in terms of how we're going to go forwards, especially now that a lot of jobs are going to be automated out as a result of AI. So we're really looking at a situation where we're going to have to make some pretty hard choices as a society. And at some point, the idea of a universal basic income that everybody gets as a result of these things that have automated us out of jobs is probably going to start looking relatively moderate.
Yeah. And here we're talking about, the dangers of automation with absent UBI. And, part of that danger is the deflationary nature of AI. So we're talking about recession potential akin to a second Great Depression, where you create a recessionary cycle where if people have less money to spend, because they've lost their jobs or their wages are stagnant, then people are buying less, which then, cuts jobs, and then they have less money, which cuts jobs. And so it's this feedback loop for the worst. And so one of the benefits of that in terms of UBI is that makes UBI's inflationary potential much less of a concern. Like, this is something where the Fed, if it had the ability to actually just put money into everyone's pockets through, like, say, personal Fed accounts or something, then it could actually combat deflation using just printed UBI, and it would have no inflationary impact because you're actually pushing up against deflation.
Right.
So there's actually, when it comes to the inflationary concern, first there's that. So there's less concern because of technology. But another thing, again, this goes back to how I described the cost of basic income being the net transfer, not the gross transfer. So if you were to, say, deficit spend a UBI into existence, so not even matching it with taxes, then it would be about $1 trillion a year in new money instead of $3 trillion a year in new money. So already, like, the inflationary impact is less. And then, of course, you could match what you spend with taxes. So there's a difference in inflationary potential between a deficit financed UBI and a deficit neutral UBI. Deficit neutral UBI would not expand the money supply at all. It's just putting spending power downward in the income spectrum. So there's more money for the lower and middle classes to spend and less money for the upper income classes to spend. And so that can still have some kind of inflationary potential, but in different products and services. And that's really kind of the key factor there is, if we increase the demand for, like, basic goods and services, which is, again, we're talking about basic income, making sure people have enough money for food and rent, clothing, electricity, these kinds of things, then we have enough for that. It's not like we don't have enough food, and it's not like people are going to start eating 2 or 3 times as much food if they have a basic income, So we should be concerned about managing the inflationary potential of basic income, but we should be smart about it and recognizing that, okay, well, what matters is economic capacity to meet demand.
Right.
So what are the things we can expect to go up in demand, and do we have enough supply for those things? And there are strategies to go about that. So, like, housing is a big concern, in which case people are worried about rents going up. But with basic income, a couple things there is that, first, we can expect more homeowners. So if more people are buying homes, then there's fewer renters.
Right.
If there's fewer renters, then there's less demand for rent, in which case that can potentially go down. You can also expect people to move from high cost of living areas to low cost of living areas. So we can expect, like, rents to go down in those really pricey areas, potentially up in these cheaper areas. And we also have to, increase housing. That's already a problem.
Yes.
So let's actually pass laws and reduce these regulations. So, one easy thing to do would be, let's stop preventing people from building multifamily housing.
Yes.
And restricting them to single family housing. Like, that is a way of reducing the inflationary potential of UBI by just passing those kind of policies.
Yes. I live in the Seattle, Washington area, and we have a massive problem with affordability right now. And that's one of the things that keeps coming up, the idea that we just need to build more multifamily. And there are people that are just absolutely pushing back on this, but at some point they're going to end up losing, simply because there just isn't enough land and there isn't enough houses, and people just keep moving here. So
yeah, and I think part of the problem, like part of the barrier to that too, that's kind of the, what are the origins of NIMBYism? A lot of it is asset appreciation of houses.
Right.
So if you're thinking of your house as like how you're going to retire, then that's a barrier. Like, you do not want anything to lower the value of your house.
Sure.
So you will fight against that. If you have a universal basic income, maybe you'll be less likely to fight against that. Like, there's this economic insecurity, this concern about if you're going to have money in the future, if you're going to have enough money, that has a lot of these kind of problems that, like, spill out into all these other areas.
And we're at a point where we're really going to have to look at some of this, because there's just too many things that are just fraying apart in society right now. Things are just starting to get really tense, and things are starting to become even more unsustainable than they have been for a while. So this is definitely an idea that we need to think about, and we need to think about why we're not doing it.
Along these lines, too, I just want to mention just another couple observations like empirical studies have shown. I like to talk about the Namibia pilot. This was a 2-year UBI experiment in Namibia in 2008, 2009, provided an entire village of 1,000 people with a basic income for everyone in the village, adult and child. And one of the impacts was that overall crime rates reduced by 42%.
Wow.
And poaching, which is the hunting of illegal animals, the illegal hunting of animals, reduced 95%. And I think those two things really speak to clearly there is an origin of crime that exists for, the need for survival income. No one really wants to go out and kill an endangered animal,
Right.
You're doing that because you absolutely feel you have to. And then, when it comes to other things like, maybe someone shoplifts for fun and like the thrill of it, but then others are doing it because they actually feel they need whatever they're stealing.
Right.
So if we want to reduce crime, that's an element of it. In the Dauphin experiment, overall crime rates reduced 15% and violent crime went down by 37%.
Wow.
And it was mostly in the form of domestic abuse, went down a lot. So there are impacts, and these are especially seen in saturation pilots. If you're looking at 150 people spread across like a large area, it's just like an individual here and there getting money, you're not going to see these decreases in crime. But if you do like an entire town or city or village or something, that's where you see these decreases in crime. And you also see these large increases in social cohesion. And another thing, of course, is health. You see these large improvements of health. In the Dauphin pilot, hospitalization rates decreased by 8.5%. And you often see decreases in, depression as well. A giant study out of Brazil looking at their Bolsa Familiar program and, decades of data found that suicide decreased by over 60% as a result of this program. So I think that just all of this points to that, yes, we can actually see this this stronger, more cohesive society with greater health and less crime. And that too goes back to what we're talking about again with cost and inflation. A lot of the money that we're spending on healthcare is because it's the result of a lack of basic income. We're spending on poverty, we're spending on insecurity and stress, all the downstream effects of that. So if we invest up front with UBI, then we're going to spend less downstream on this other stuff. And that also has inflationary implications where if we're spending less money because we're putting money up front, then it's not going to have the same impact. You're gonna put say prison guards out of work,
Right.
And they're not going to be having that money to spend from their prison wages, and that's going to be this kind of inflationary offset. And again, that's why it's cheaper too.
Sure. And we can retrain them with some of the money we're going to save by not keeping people locked up in the numbers that we do.
Right. I mean, it's bad for overall economic capacity for people to be doing jobs that are essentially unnecessary or even socially harmful. So let's actually have all these people doing this, healthcare administration jobs, doing something else, thanks to single payer healthcare and thanks to healthier people requiring less healthcare.
Right.
When it comes to prisons, let's have these people doing other jobs instead of these jobs that only exist because of the crime that would not exist if UBI existed,
Yeah. So we're definitely at a point where we've seen enough data. As you said, there have been hundreds, if not thousands, of empirical studies at this point of all sorts of numbers, all sorts of circumstances, and it all comes off very much like an idea that's time has come. I did find it really interesting that when I was, doing some research, one of the first links that comes up is a sponsored link from the Heritage Foundation talking about why this is such a bad idea.
Right.
And it's kind of like, of course, of course you would say that. That's kind of so on brand for you. It's not even funny.
Yeah, they're actually putting money into banning pilots. They don't even want states to experiment with pilots.
Gee, wonder why that is. Scott, thank you so much for coming on to talk to me about this today. I really appreciate your time. And this is, like I said, an idea I've been really curious about. And one of the really lucky things about doing this show is that sometimes I can reach out to people and ask questions of, experts in the field that are interesting. And especially in a situation like this, where we're trying to figure out how do we go forward from some really difficult and frustrating times as a society, and this definitely seems like something we should at least be considering, if not implementing as fast as we can.
Yeah, it's a deep and I would say healthy rabbit hole to go down. So thank you for taking your step into it and your dive. And I look forward to you going deeper and just seeing how deep it goes.
Yeah, well, I definitely am in the rabbit hole now on this one, and we will indeed see how deep it goes. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time. You have a great rest of your day, okay?
Thanks, Griff. You too.
Thanks for listening to the Did Nothing Wrong podcast. If you want to hear more, you can find us on the web at didnothingwrongpod.com. Please make sure you subscribe to get our content straight into your inbox. You can also follow us on Twitter at GrizaBJJ, GRZABJJ, as well as DNWPod. We're extremely grateful for paid subscriptions and donations that allow us to keep doing this important work. Thanks, and remember, everyone mentioned did nothing wrong.